Good evening. I've just been given a very clear signal up there that it's time to start. I know very many of you, but for those I don't know, I am Mark Bursell, Director for Research and Collections for Cambridge University Libraries. I'm just aiming my face now at this microphone and hoping you can hear me. It is my very pleasant duty to welcome everyone here, members of the university and many distinguished guests, to this year's Sandars Lecture, which, as most of us will know, is the latest in a series reaching right back to the 1890s. And with the Sandars Lectureship, the Sandars Readership, I should say, in Bibliography, established with a very generous bequest of £2,000 by one Samuel Sandars of Trinity College. He was also an extremely generous donor of books and manuscripts to the university library. But equally, it's my job to give a very warm welcome on your behalf to our distinguished speaker, Joan Winterkorn, who is one of the world's most renowned advisors on archives and manuscripts. And as noted yesterday by Jess Gardner, the university librarian, Joan was deservedly awarded the MBE in the New Year's Honours for 2023 for services to heritage, which among other things have included work serving the AIL panel dealing with cultural property, and I think we'll hear more of that this evening, work with the Export Review Committee, and work with almost every library and archive in the United Kingdom, as well as a multiplicity of other really distinguished bodies, including the Pilgrim Trust, the National Heritage Memorial Fund, the John Murray Foundation, the Friends of the Nation's Libraries. I can't name check them all. If you are involved in one and I've not name checked you, I apologise, but it gives a sense of the scale of Joan's friendships and networks and the contribution she has made in this field over many decades. Yesterday, Joan set out a fantastic stall giving the sense of the wider political, economic policy content, the economic context of the trade and exchange of books, and in particular archives, reaching right back to the cult of the autograph letter in the 19th century. Today she's taking us much more into the coalface, and I think we shall hear some interesting gossip, retrospective and otherwise, about the experience of the attics and the tin trunks and the multiple collections with which Joan has worked. And also to note in passing that Joan is, in addition and very kindly, leading an all-day workshop tomorrow at the University Library with members of our own curatorial team, who she's worked with closely over many years, for early career researchers who will get, I think, the undivided attention for the best part of the day from a very distinguished practitioner. So thank you, Joan, for doing that. May I ask you please to welcome our Sandars reader for this year, the very distinguished Joan Winterkorn.
Yesterday, we looked at the trade in British archives and manuscripts, how it has changed, particularly over the last 50 years, and how the collaborative efforts of a number of individuals, societies, working groups, funders, librarians, and archivists made it possible, even fashionable, to acquire modern literary collections and the papers of living writers. Today, I want to leave behind all those policies and politics of collecting and give you an idea of life at the archival coalface and some of the archives that have shaped my own work. In 1979, when I went to work for Bernard Quaritch, very few people in the book trade were interested in archives or willing to value them. There were some specialists in fields like music, but apart from a few auction house staff, there were no generalists. Being a generalist is not an advantage in many disciplines, and I didn't set out with that as a goal. But with every fresh archive, I found myself drawn into the papers, the lives they revealed, the history unfolding. Give any archive a chance, ask it the right questions, avoid assumptions, look beyond the obvious, and it will tell you its story. What you discover from original manuscripts and archives, I think, has a different impact from what you read in printed form. And I think you retain that knowledge in a different way. I didn't want to limit my interest to any one period or person or topic, so I simply said yes to every sort of archive that came along and was soon an accidental generalist. Working at the coalface is a great privilege. It is also a challenge, particularly when you are faced with trunks and boxes of papers, unsorted, uncatalogued, papers in attics, outbuildings, unheated stately homes in midwinter. Where do you start? Who are all these correspondents? Was anyone in this family not named William? Who removed all the letters from their envelopes? Is this the last page of the incomplete letter I saw 2 boxes back? And is there any place that I can spread out all the papers without the owner's dog coming in with muddy paws? When I'm working instead in a well-ordered reading room on a fully catalogued archive, I tend to spare a thought for the archivists and curators who have made it accessible. Dust removed, order imposed, I will be able to request several items at a time, knowing what will be put in front of me. But I occasionally wish the papers had been mine to explore before they were flattened, boxed, and indexed. A good place to start might be the Pansanger Archive. The estate and personal papers of the Earls Cooper of Cole Green House and Pansanger in Hertfordshire, and their descendants, including the Lamb family and the Grenfells. Dating from 1280 to the 1950s and housed in more than 250 boxes, much of the archive had been on deposit at the Hertfordshire Record Office for 4 decades, where it was the largest collection of documents they cared for. A further deposit of Grenfell papers was made in 1983 by Lady Ravensdale. A decade later, her executors offered the archive by private treaty sale through Christie's, and the Record Office asked Quaritch to provide an independent valuation. Like many of the great family and estate collections, the archive includes significant correspondence and papers from successive generations of Coopers and families who had married the Coopers. The men stood out, especially the first Earl, who served as commissioner for the Union with Scotland and as Lord Chancellor, and William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, twice Prime Minister, whose sister married the 5th Earl. But in the weeks I spent in the Record Office, it was the wives I found particularly fascinating. Dame Sarah Cooper, 1644 to 1720, was wife of the 2nd Baronet and mother of the 1st Earl. A friend of many literary figures, her papers included commonplace books with transcripts of verse and prose. 2 decades before I saw the papers, Professor Alan Pritchard of Toronto had discovered in one of them a transcript of all 3 books of Abraham Cowley's poem, The Civil War. The first book had not been published until a dozen years after his death in 1679. It was long thought Cowley had destroyed the other 2 books. It then transpired not only were there transcripts in the commonplace book, but they had been made from the original manuscript, which Dame Sarah also preserved. The first volume was in the hands of an amanuensis. The second and third were in Cowley's hand. Dame Sarah also kept a diary. Her 7 full volumes mention public affairs and social events, but I was drawn to her intimate personal reflections. She was not a happy woman. Frustrated by her marriage, feeling trapped and isolated in a stately home with hostile servants while her husband spent his time in London, the diaries revealed much about the role of privileged women in the early years of the 18th century. I made a careful note to myself that the diaries offered much to study and ponder, and was pleased that several years later they were transcribed and edited, and Dame Sarah now features in many scholarly books and articles. Prime Minister Lord Melbourne's papers included political journals, the manuscript of his autobiography, and an autograph volume of criticism of Lord Byron's poetry. Byron was a more prominent presence in the papers of his estranged wife, Lady Caroline Lamb, as he had been in her life. There were albums and notebooks of Lady Caroline's autographed verse and stories, sketches and self-portraits, commonplace books, letters to her husband and son, and the 2nd edition of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. It had been inscribed by Byron to Lady Caroline on the 30th of July, 1812, 4 months after their tempestuous affair began, and a day after they had almost eloped. It was through Lady Ravensdale, granddaughter of Lord and Lady Desborough, that the Grenfell papers were added to the Pansanger archive. William Grenfell appears to have been a dedicated athlete and sportsman. Cricket, rowing, swimming, mountaineering, fishing, big game hunting, and fencing all kept him busy and frequently away from home. In between his sporting expeditions, he managed to serve as an MP, first as a Gladstonian Liberal and then as Conservative, before he was raised to the peerage as Baron Desborough. The correspondence in the Grenfell papers is extensive, some tens of thousands of letters, but the great majority of these were to his wife, Ethel, always known as Etty. Etty was an indefatigable hostess and an active and engaging correspondent. Her wide circle of friends included politicians, writers, and artists. She was said to be the confidante of 6 prime ministers, and Oscar Wilde dedicated a story to her in A House of Pomegranates. The Desboroughs were also the parents of 3 sons and 2 daughters. Their eldest son, Julian, born in 1888, was educated at Eton and went up to Balliol, where he became known for his athleticism, but also his rowdy behavior, unstable moods, and indeed bullying. His studies suffered as a result. He took a past degree and spent time hunting and fishing before commissioned in the British Army in 1907, attached to the 1st Royal Dragoons in 1910. Julian Grenfell then served in India, then South Africa. He disliked both locations apart from the sport they offered, and he considered leaving the army for a career in politics. With the outbreak of war, his regiment returned, and by October 1914, they were deployed to the Western Front and in action at the First Battle of Ypres. In November, he won the DSO. His letters to his mother offer a vivid picture of the alternate boredom and terror of the war and the need for officers to supplement supplies of their troops. He requests, and his mother sends, food and drink, cigarettes, which seldom seem to arrive, warm and waterproof clothing, and this I found particularly touching, an accurate map of France. In his letter of April 30th, 1915, Julian speaks of his sadness at the death of Rupert Brooke and encloses his autographed manuscript of Into Battle, the poem he had written the previous evening, telling his mother to forward it to the Times if she wished. Not quite a fortnight later, Grenfell was wounded and moved to hospital, where the severity of his wounds became apparent. His parents were with him when he died on the 26th of May, with the Times publishing Into Battle the following day, along with the notification of his death. I was surprised to find that he had tucked into his diary a second retained autographed manuscript of Into Battle. Having read all of Julian's letters home, I found that his diary revealed an increasingly bleak picture of the war, differing in ways from what he had shared with his family. And who knows how his views would have changed or what poetry he might have written had he survived. There were hundreds of letters of condolence in the archive, letters about Julian's death and that of his younger brother Billy, who was killed leading a counterattack in Flanders just 2 months later. I do my best not to weep openly in reading rooms, though tears are often part of this job, but the grief in these letters was almost overwhelming. There were letters from mothers who had also lost sons, and mothers whose sons were at the front, from friends including Asquith, Morris, Baring, Hilaire Belloc, A.C. Benson, and down through a very long alphabetical list. The older poets and writers who mourned the death of this soldier poet reflected on their own lives, on death, and on the afterlife. Winston Churchill had known and frequently socialized with the Desboroughs since 1901. He wrote to Julian's parents that their son was all that you could have desired and all that our race needs to keep its honor fair and bright. He at any rate lived and died as he would have wished. Maybe. In 1927, when Churchill published the third volume of his masterful History of the First World War, the final chapter of the World Crisis, 1916 to 1918, opened with 10 lines from Into Battle. And it was a mere 14 years after that book on the First World War when the first collection of Churchill's Second World War speeches was published. And he entitled the volume Into Battle. There's the man. There's the book. Churchill had written to Etty Desborough requesting her permission to include Julian's poem. The work was already in the press, and it was not until the sixth edition, the sixth printing, that his poem finally appears. When Lord Desborough died in January 1945, having outlived all three of his sons by several decades, Churchill wrote once more to Etty. He spoke about her husband and his own hopes that the world would be safe for another generation. The England we adored is, alas, no more, but another England is arising. Before my work on the Poundsanger Archive, I had encountered the Grenville family in the Chartwell Papers, Winston Churchill's archive at Churchill College. Since 1992, when I first worked in the Churchill archives, I've seen their collections grow apace and the archive center prosper. Many of the political and scientific archives that now share the vaults with Sir Winston have been gifted to the archives or have been allocated through the acceptance in lieu scheme. Lady Thatcher's papers are there, and Nobel Prize-winning scientists, including the IVF pioneer Robert Edwards, whose centenary has just been celebrated, the physicist Max Born, and Sir Joseph Rotblat, who worked on the development of atomic energy in England and then at Los Alamos. His Nobel Prize was not for physics, but for his later anti-nuclear war work with Bertrand Russell and the establishment of pugwash. 3 days after Julian Grenfell's death, Siegfried Sassoon was granted a commission as a second lieutenant in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He had joined the army the previous August, the day war was declared, but an injury had kept him out of active service and spared him from the Gallipoli campaign. Sassoon arrived in France in November 1915, working originally as a transport officer, supplying communication trenches. From his diaries, we know that within days of arriving, he had tea with R.G., a young poet, captain in the 3rd Battalion, and very much disliked. An interesting creature, overstrong and self-conscious, a defier of convention. That captain was the poet Robert Graves, and when they met again several days later, Graves lent me his manuscript poems to read, some very bad, violent and repulsive, a few full of promise and real beauty. It was the beginning of a profound friendship. In March 1916, Sassoon moved to a frontline position. In the journals he kept at the front, the poems he wrote, the sketches he made, his declaration against the war, which might have led to his being tried for treason if Robert Graves had not intervened, Siegfried Sassoon left a picture of the Great War more powerful, I believe, than any other record. A small, oblong black notebook dated April 1917 opens with a diary dealing with the sleepless days. The sleepless days of movement, discomfort, cold, snowstorms, mud, rain, rations growing short, the trenches, and the hellish sights of dead bodies, the bombing attack down the Hindenburg Front Trench, where the dead and living were very, very nearly one, for death was in all our hearts. Sassoon reveals the depths of his agony, his thoughts on the destruction of youth, the whole torment of waste and despair. There are drafts of his poems, and it's impossible to think how he was able to write them in such circumstances. Lists of fellow soldiers killed and wounded. Traces of the mud of the trenches can still be found between the leaves. When Sotheby's offered Cambridge University Library the opportunity to purchase Sassoon's wartime journals and notebooks, his letters home, and other manuscripts and papers, the response from the university, the funding bodies, and from poets, scholars, and the general public was swift. An appeal was launched by Lord Egremont, Sassoon's authorized biographer, and the only person to have had access to the journals. Fundraising events were organized, including one at Parliament, and the collection was purchased in 2009. By 2014, the University Library had digitized the war diaries and poetry notebooks and published them online. And if you have never looked at them, you really should. Even in digitized form, turning the pages on a screen, the diaries are profoundly disturbing and powerfully moving. They are available to everyone, including all the school children who study the war and the war poets. And it is, I think, a great tribute to the University Library and to all who helped to secure the archive for Cambridge. The end of the war, which of course never really ended for Sassoon and so many others, brings me to Muriel Spark, who was born, as she would note, on the first day of the second month of the last year of the First World War. My introduction to Muriel came through an Italian count, whose employer was a friend of Quaritch's owner, Lord Parmore. She wished to find someone to assist with the sale of her papers, and I was put in touch with her. This was in late 1990, and we arranged that I would visit Muriel in January at the home of her great friend and companion, Penelope Jardine, in the hills above Arezzo in Tuscany. Dates were finally agreed, flights booked. We hadn't anticipated the launch of Operation Desert Storm, with American F-111s from Lakenheath supporting the bombardment of Iraq. But I somehow, from my sense of Muriel, felt it was best to stick with our agreed plans. When I arrived at Heathrow, it was surrounded by troops and armored vehicles, heavily armed police patrolling the terminal. There were very few other passengers for them to defend, and I had to wonder, in dealing with Muriel, what sort of operation I was undertaking. Some writers create and curate their own archives with care and deliberation. Others simply dump their papers into boxes and black sacks and file them in the attic or the garden shed. Muriel confessed that she was a hoarder of two things, documents and trusted friends. And in the autobiography she wrote in her 70s, Curriculum Vitae, she explained that she was determined to write nothing that cannot be supported by documentary evidence. I can certainly vouch for her hoarding instincts and the range of the unedited and unexpurgated raw evidence that I encountered on my first visit. Her numerous trunks and boxes of papers were in a suite of rooms at the top of a steep stone staircase, allowing me to work on them undisturbed and at any and all hours of the day and night, with my bed being in the next room, just in case I needed to work a little further in the wee hours. Muriel had drawn on these papers when writing Curriculum Vitae, which would be published the following year. Those trunks and boxes contained the seemingly trivial, including from her early hungry years, a ration book, the receipt for a typewriter ribbon, bookseller's invoices, a tiny notebook in which she recorded each sheet of carbon paper she bought and every postage stamp. And as you can see here, articles that she had sent out, poems that she had sent out, whether they were returned or not, most of them returned, and still at the bottom, got it, with a story that was published and began to change her life. She was, in those early days, a girl of very slender means. But along with that, there was her journal recording a meeting with John Masefield, notes on the theological writings of John Henry Newman, and her own conversion to Catholicism, letters from Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Iris Murdoch, Harold Macmillan, Gore Vidal, and John Updike, from the poets whose work filled the small magazines of the late 1940s and early 1950s, editors, agents, publishers, film producers, and Tiny Lizardi, her faithful landlady in Camberwell, who I later realized figures in almost every novel she wrote. Muriel was a poet before she began writing biographies, stories, and novels, and at the age of 14, she won first prize in a competition among the schools of Edinburgh with a poem about Sir Walter Scott. Her classmate and closest friend, Frances Niven, marked the occasion by writing a poem to Muriel and making a small laurel wreath out of colored wax. Muriel could quote Frances's poem in her autobiography because she still had the manuscript, as well as the delicate wax wreath, carefully preserved in cotton wool in a small cardboard box. She also kept the manuscripts of her own early poems, written when she and Frances were taught by Miss Christina Kay, experiences she later transformed and immortalized in The Prom of Miss Jean Brodie. And there is the classful with Miss Kay in the middle. When Miss Kay predicted Muriel's future as a writer in the most emphatic terms, as she remembered, I felt I hardly had much choice in the matter. I realized that Muriel never wasted anything. Her friendships, acquaintances, interests, surroundings, and work experiences, the books she read and the conversations she overheard, all went into the fiction she shaped with such insight and humor. In carefully preserving from an early age her correspondence, papers, annotated books, the working drafts and manuscripts of her novels, even invoices from the hairdressers and beauty parlors she could afford to visit after the success of her first novel, she was also her own archivist. Over several days of lunches and dinners in the kitchen on that first visit, we talked about the papers I was inspecting. I had, or I thought I was developing, a good idea of the stories they told and would ask Muriel about various people and events. Her replies were not always what I had anticipated. Her descriptions of people and interpretations of events quite different to the assumptions I had been making. Was she offering guidelines and instructions? Well, not overtly, but she certainly made me think again about how we read the evidence in archives. It is the incoming correspondence which often enhances the research interest and commercial value of modern literary archives, especially before emails replaced the typed and written letter. Some writers may retain copies of their own letters, but the majority of the epistolary evidence often derives from the letters received. Why should I assume, as I had been assuming, Muriel was responsible for, or reciprocated, the romantic outpourings of middle-aged, besotted poets, many of them married, when she was General Secretary of the Poetry Society? Was someone else's description of an event they attended together, or a conversation they had, more accurate than her own memory? Whose story is it, and which, if either, is true? As Muriel already knew and would be reminded again over the coming years, incoming correspondence can be a dangerous trap for biographers. After preparing a report on Muriel's papers and discussing the price she felt they should achieve, a price I was happy to support, we turned to the question of where they should be offered. In 1962, Derek Stanford, Muriel's one-time friend and companion, sold to the American book dealer Lou Feldman the 70 intimate letters she had written to him. Feldman then contacted Muriel, hoping to purchase some of her manuscripts. When she declined, he told her about the letters to Stanford, offering to sell them back to her for $1,500. She was livid, angry both with Stanford and the blackmailing Feldman. She refused this offer, too, and Feldman sold her letters to Texas. Thinking about where to place the archive, I had mentioned the National Library of Scotland. Knowing of my visit to Italy, they had written to Muriel to assure her of their interest. Muriel, however, had different ideas. They are obviously anxious to be in the market for my papers, she wrote me, but quite honestly, I would much prefer to sell to the United States and hope Texas will be a bright possibility. Having acquired some of her manuscripts and professional correspondence when he was at the University of Tulsa, Tom Staley was keen to purchase these papers for Texas. A curator joined me in Tuscany to survey what was on offer. Then some months passed as Texas considered the acquisition and all the other demands on their budget. Eventually, Tom Staley wrote offering in dollars, but we had been asking in pounds. Muriel cheerfully suggested that if he couldn't pay the full price now, he could pay half this year and half next year. And I had to explain that this was not the basis of his offer. Would she be happy for me to speak with Scotland? I will never know, but I suspect at some level she had been reluctant to be reclaimed by Edinburgh, the city she had left more than half a century earlier, and where she might be seen as just a Scottish writer. But she agreed I could contact them, and before long there was a formal offer on the table. By July 1992, the National Library of Scotland was holding a reception to celebrate the acquisition. I made many subsequent visits to Italy, and we met in London, Essex, and Cambridge. There were further archive sales to the library in her lifetime, and one final sale after her death. Muriel would often remind me how fortunate it was she made me sell her archive to Scotland. You would have sent it off to Texas, Joan. Muriel died in 2006 on Good Friday. Early the next year, I arranged to spend several days with Penelope, carefully planning my visit to arrive the day before Muriel's 1st of February birthday, the first day of the second month, so we could spend that day together. The afternoon I arrived, we walked down the lane to the small local cemetery where her headstone says simply, Muriel Spark, Poeta, with the years of her birth and death. Over supper in the kitchen, we made plans for the following day, and I went off to bed. At some point in the early hours, I woke to the sound of something beating on the windows in my room at the top of the house. It's all very Wuthering Heights, I thought. Opening the inside shutter, I found the wind was raging and heavy snow falling, as if to announce it was Muriel's birthday. By morning, there was more than a foot of snow, blocking all the doors and windows, and it continued all that day and into the next. We were completely snowed in, making meals from what remained in the freezer and in the cupboards, with no outings or restaurants to distract us, though fortunately enough red wine and wood for the fire. Penelope and I spent our days going through the papers that were still on Muriel's desk, and our evenings by the fire speaking of her. The morning of my flight home, the sun had come out and the snowplow had made it up the hill, so we were able to get to the train station in Arezzo for my onward journey. When planning this lecture, I hadn't anticipated that I would have to refer to Tony Harrison in the past tense. One of the nation's most powerful, eloquent, and distinguished poets, a leading theater and film poet, a master of the rhyming couplet. He died 6 weeks ago. Like Dame Muriel, Tony defined himself simply as a poet. Poetry is all I write, whether for books or readings, or for the National Theatre, or for the Opera House and Concert Hall, or even for TV. All these activities are part of the same quest for a public poetry, though in that word public, I would never want to exclude inwardness. While much that he wrote was personal, reflecting and revealing aspects of his childhood and his relations with his family, particularly his parents, he was never afraid of the political or the controversial. From war, the arms trade, and religious intolerance to football hooliganism, he addressed the most difficult issues in contemporary society with uncompromising honesty. Through his translations and adaptations, he brought Greek drama, the medieval mystery plays, and French drama to fresh audiences. Harrison was raised in a working-class home in Leeds, a home without books, his father a baker. He won a scholarship to Leeds Grammar School, and from there went to the University of Leeds, where he completed a degree in classics, took a diploma in linguistics, and researched verse translations of Virgil's Aeneid. Close friends at Leeds, with whom he appeared in student reviews and who remained friends all of his life, included the Nigerian Wole Soyinka, the first African writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and the comedian Barrie Cooke. After university, Tony went to northern Nigeria, where he lectured for 4 years at a newly opened university and wrote his first play, before going to Prague for a year, where he also taught. In 1968, as a UNESCO Fellow, he traveled to Cuba, Brazil, Senegal, and the Gambia. Richard Eyre, who as director of the National Theatre worked closely with Tony and later made the television film of Tony reading V, his most famous and controversial poem, wrote an acknowledgement of the poet's talents some years ago. It's my favorite summary of Tony Harrison, and I was glad that Sir Richard repeated it in his recent tribute. The baker's son from Leeds is probably the most cosmopolitan man I know, multilingual, Greek, ancient and modern, Latin, Italian, French, Czech, Hausa, much traveled, a citizen, as they say, of the world, living rather precariously between London, Florida, New York, and Newcastle. An expert in many cultures with a curiosity about most others. Fastidiously knowledgeable about food, wine, music, and the theater. Tender, witty, wry, volatile, living up or down to the Yorkshire stereotype only in his rare but formidable stubbornness and intransigence. The man is the work. Well, those who write for a living, who have no other jobs or means of support, can hit lean times. This can be particularly difficult for playwrights if there is no one prepared to put a play on the stage or provide backing for an independent production. In 2002, Tony Harrison was in need of funds for a project he had in mind and invited me to Newcastle to see his archive. The shelves on one wall of his study were filled with his bound notebooks containing multiple drafts of his work. They usually comprise autograph notes and first drafts with subsequent typed drafts, further revised and autographed, often many versions and reworkings laid on top. It might be more accurate to call these volumes commonplace books or scrapbooks, as he pasted in notes, quotations, postcards, wine labels, book labels, postal receipts, incoming correspondence, newspaper reproductions, newspaper articles, and whatever else caught his attention. His own drawings and doodles or stage and set designs were scattered throughout. The far wall had large boxes of papers documenting Harrison's theater, film, and opera projects, research materials, working drafts, annotated and rehearsal scripts. Oops, sorry. Let's go back one. Research materials, working drafts, annotated and rehearsal scripts, rehearsal schedules and directing notes, programs, photographs, reviews and fan letters, and extensive correspondence with Harrison Birtwistle, the set designer Jocelyn Herbert, directors John Dexter, Richard Eyre, Peter Hall, and Michael Cousteau, with actors and actresses. It was a surprise to find his song lyrics for the 1976 film The Bluebird, based on Maeterlinck's play, directed by George Cukor. A rare co-production between the United States and the Soviet Union, it was largely filmed in Leningrad, where Tony joined the cast and crew. And what a cast! Elizabeth Taylor, Ava Gardner, Jane Fonda, and Patsy Kensit, all playing major roles. David Bowie had turned down a chance to join the cast, wisely as it turned out. The film barely received 1 star from most reviewers. The Brotherton Library at Leeds purchased Tony Harrison's archive in 2007, with a second tranche of papers, later papers added in 2014. That an archive as rich and wide-ranging as this connects with, complements, and supplements archives held in many other national and international libraries is obvious. Richard Eyre's papers are now at Texas. Peter Hall is at the British Library. Jocelyn Herbert at the National Theatre. Many fellow Loyners at the Brotherton, and the papers of the poets with whom Tony Harrison corresponded are in libraries everywhere. There's a very curious Cambridge connection which I always find amusing. One of Tony Harrison's final plays, Fram, performed at the National Theatre, provides an unexpected link. The play manages to include Sybil Thorndike, the ghost of Gilbert Murray, and famine in Russia. But at the heart of it is the Norwegian explorer Nansen and his 1893 expedition to reach the North Pole in the specially designed vehicle Fram. By 1910, Fram belonged to another Norwegian explorer, Roald Amundsen. Having planned an Arctic expedition, Amundsen altered course after hearing that Robert Peary had reached the North Pole. He turned south instead. Captain Robert Scott, who had set out from Cardiff on his second Antarctic expedition and hoped to be the first man to reach the South Pole, Only discovered this when he arrived in Melbourne. A telegram from Amundsen was waiting. Beg to inform you, Fram proceeding Antarctic. When Scott, with his party of 4 men, did finally reach the South Pole on the 17th of January, 1912, Amundsen's flag was already planted there, along with a letter written 5 weeks earlier. In the Kennett Archive, the University Library has fascinating correspondence to and from Captain Scott's wife, Kathleen, along with her diaries. Her 1912 diary is perhaps the most notable. In January of that year, as Scott is in sight of the pole, she is visiting Germany and writes at length about Nansen. Nansen came to give 2 lectures in Berlin, and I saw a tremendous lot of him. We went to the picture galleries together. He knows a very great deal about art, and we went to the Philharmonic concert. Nansen was clearly very fond of Kathleen, and the Kennett Archive contains a substantial volume of his letters to her. On the 6th of March, 1912, Kathleen notes the rumor circulating that Scott has reached the pole, followed the next day by the clash and turmoil of learning that it was not her husband, but Amundsen, who had traveled to the Antarctic in Nansen's Fram, who reached the pole first. Inspecting archives in situ is always instructive and often a great pleasure. What I have learned from spending time with authors, artists, scientists, the owners of historical archives, or their descendants, has added immeasurably to my understanding of those archives. There have been uncomfortable days working in attic rooms in midwinter, where it was possible to switch on a single light bulb or 1 bar of the heater, but certainly not both. Or in a remote house almost at the tip of Cornwall, where the rain fell steadily for days and I had to be locked into the room where I was working to protect me from some of the inhabitants in the house. But set against these are memories of days in Tuscany with Muriel Spark or the translator William Weaver, conversations with Francis Crick in his office overlooking the Pacific Ocean, or hearing the church bells of Ottery St. Mary chime throughout the night in the house where the Coleridge family had lived for generations. Occasionally an archive arrives on my doorstep, and I am able to work on the papers at home. Several years ago, I agreed to do a probate valuation of what I thought would be 6 file boxes of papers. As the house of the deceased barrister had been sold, his son would arrange for them to be sent to me before returning to his own home in Western Canada. What then arrived was 30 large storage boxes of entirely unsorted papers dating back to the late 19th century. The barrister, Jeremy Hutchinson, had died at 102, and it was not just his own personal and legal archive, but papers from his parents, who had been intimately involved with the Bloomsbury Group. It took months to sort, identify, and catalog the archive, with papers spread through almost every room in the house. But I don't know how I could have completed that job any other way. Even for a barrister as eminent as Lord Hutchinson, the HMRC does not extend probate deadlines. After the Hutchinson papers, there was a brief gap when domestic order was restored, but I soon gave house room to the papers and later the artwork of Barrie Cooke. Now, if Barrie Cooke is not a familiar name, I trust he soon will be. Born in Knutsford in 1931 to an English father and an American mother, Cooke spent part of his childhood in Jamaica and Bermuda before moving to the United States. He studied art history at Harvard University, then returned briefly to England before taking a ferry to Ireland, where he is reported to have said he immediately felt at home. After a year in Austria, studying with Oskar Kokoschka, Cooke returned to Ireland, initially to the Burn, where Seamus Heaney later wrote, "He was a man holed up in a shack, fishing and hunting and painting." Cooke himself remembered that I started really painting about 1958. It began with a painting of the surface of water. You see, I was a fisherman. Home was where there was water. From the shack, Cooke moved to Kilkenny, and in 1974 was one of the founders of the Kilkenny Arts Festival. Cooke, Heaney said, had the same kind of eagerness about poetry as he had about paintings or salmon pools. The festival attracted poets, and in addition to the formal events, there were evenings of what I gather was truly memorable hospitality. Ted Hughes and Seamus Heaney, already friends of Cooke, were often present, and John Montague, the American poet Jean Valentine, and many others were added to the circle. Manuscripts, typescripts, and correspondence by Ted Hughes and Seamus Heaney, themselves, of course, close friends, formed the central core of the Barrie Cooke archive. The letters reveal the special relationship each poet had with Cooke. It was a closeness built not just on their poetry and Barrie Cooke's art, but also on a shared interest in fishing, a love of rivers, lakes, water, and the natural world. For Barrie and Ted, fishing was an abiding passion. Seamus may not have been as devoted a fisherman, but his poetry is infused with images of trout, tench, salmon, eels, and water. If Cooke inspired his friends to pick up their pens and put paper in the typewriter, he in turn was inspired by them. He worked collaboratively with Seamus Heaney on Sweeney Astray and on his bog poems, and it really was collaboratively. This was not a matter of an artist coming in to illustrate something that had been written. There was a great deal more collaboration between the two of them on both of these. And he produced powerful crow drawings and Irish pike to accompany poems or recordings by Ted Hughes. The unexpected typescript of an unpublished story by Seamus Heaney, Ronan and the Riverman, included Cooke's drawings on the typescript and separate pages of sketches with his thoughts about the story. When I had finished my work on the papers and was preparing to speak with Barrie Cooke's daughters, one of them got in touch. They still had his cottage in County Sligo, and the studio there was filled with his work. Might any of it be of interest? After a weekend of discovery and revelation of the cottage and studio and glorious views over the lake, we added to the archive all the artwork related to the writers, a sketchbook with drawings of Ted and his son Nicholas Hughes fishing, a large visitor's book filled with poems, some unpublished, illustrations and sketches. Barrie Cooke's portrait of Ted Hughes may be in the National Portrait Gallery, but his fine watercolor portrait of Seamus Heaney is in the Cooke Archive, now at Pembroke College. You will have an opportunity to discover more next year when the University Library's major exhibition, being held jointly with Pembroke College, will be based on the Barrie Cooke Archive. As most of you will know, Ted Hughes was an undergraduate at Pembroke for some years, and for some years the college has been collecting books, manuscripts, letters, and ephemera by and about him. When considering where the Cooke Archive might be sold, I thought it could enrich and expand Pembroke's Hughes collection, give it a different dimension. Before the college could take a decision, it was suggested that the master ought to come and see the archive, and so he did. Some years earlier, the master had been the first chairman of a group I spoke about yesterday, the UK Working Group on the Literary Heritage, where we had had many discussions about keeping papers in Britain. I was delighted but not surprised that the master, now the university's chancellor, Lord Smith, responded with great enthusiasm and gave his strong backing to the college's fundraising efforts. We began yesterday in the Albemarle Street drawing room of the publisher John Murray and the burning of Byron's memoirs. I mentioned John Murray II and the 4 other men who decided to destroy the manuscript. There was, however, a 6th man present when the deed was done. John Murray II asked his son, John Murray III, to join them and to witness the act. While the 2nd John Murray will be forever associated with Lord Byron, the 3rd John Murray was far more interested in scientists, explorers, travelers, and archaeologists. At the age of 18, he was sent to Edinburgh to study, where he was delighted with the natural history lectures, attended the theatrical dinner, where Sir Walter Scott acknowledged his authorship of the Waverley novels, and, as he wrote to his parents, met an American who'd been exhibiting paintings of birds drawn by himself, named Audubon or something similar. It appears his paths never crossed with another young man studying natural history in Edinburgh. 3 decades later, now firmly, can I go back one? 3 decades later, now firmly established as head of the publishing firm, he did receive a letter from this young man. My dear sir, I have heard with pleasure from my friend Sir Charles Lyell that you were inclined to publish my work on the origin of species, but that before deciding or offering any terms, you require to see my manuscript. My work is divided into 12 chapters, as you will see. It's pendant in the table at the end. Well, this quite extraordinary letter from Charles Darwin goes on to outline the origin chapter by chapter. He explains that the introduction and the first 3 chapters of his books are in the hands of 3 copyists, but could be sent on in 10 days, saying, I defy anyone not familiar with my handwriting and odd arrangement to make out my manuscript till fairly copied. And I suspect the dedicated editors and staff who have worked on the monumental Darwin Correspondence Project since it was founded in 1974 might agree about the ease of deciphering his handwriting. Without waiting to see further, Murray made a generous offer of terms. Darwin accepted with pleasure, though he was still anxious for Murray to see the manuscript. He added as a postscript that I may as well mention that I shall require 1 diagram engraved on copper on sheet to fold out, but it consists only of lines and letters and figures and cannot be all too expensive to engrave. Once Murray was in receipt of Darwin's manuscript, he gave it to Whitwell Elwyn to read. I should have said the Reverend Whitwell Elwyn, for he was a clergyman, rector of Booton in Norfolk, as well as a critic and editor of the Quarterly Review. Elwyn wrote to Murray from the rectory. He had formed a strong opinion against the book and even discussed his reservations with Charles Lyell. Elwyn's objection, or at least his ostensible objection, was that Darwin put forth his theory without evidence. Where is the proof? It is to ask the jury for a verdict without putting the witness into the box. The letter goes on in this vein for many pages. You only see the beginning and the end. It's an extraordinary letter. His handwriting becomes larger, heavier, and darker with each page, and the pen almost cutting through the paper. He was a clergyman. Perhaps he could see where Darwin's theory might lead. Elwyn finally suggested that Darwin might instead promulgate his theories by a limited focus, which would prepare the way for a larger work. Darwin should concentrate on pigeons, he said. Everybody is interested in pigeons. Well, Elwyn lost that battle, and on the 24th of November, 1859, John Murray published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. It wasn't the only book that the firm published that day. The author of the other volume had, like Darwin, studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh. Samuel Smiles' Self-Help, a tribute to the virtues of thrift, perseverance, and self-reliance, was an immediate success, selling an unprecedented number of copies. Both books are included in Printing in the Mind of Man. Over the years I've worked with archives, I've loved seeing how separate collections connect to one another, how characters in one archive show up elsewhere like old friends, how I will come across letters that tell the other side of the story I thought I understood. When you untie those pink ribbons and begin reading bundles of letters or open a diary that may not have been consulted since the last entry was made, you have to make an investment in the voices and stories you will release. It is why this work is such a privilege. My role is not to be a judge or jury, to praise or condemn. It is to try to tease out and tell the archive story and be its spokesman. Often this is a solo and even at times lonely task, though occasionally I have shared valuation with Felix Pryor, who is here this evening. One of the bonuses of working with Felix is that we have so many mutual friends, dead for a century or more in many cases, but still in our thoughts. We worked together on the Coleridge family papers, then still in the family home in Ottery St. Mary. There were 3 generations of Coleridge family judges and hundreds of volumes of their judge books with notes made while presiding over some of the most significant legal trials between 1835 and 1923. But it is the diaries and letters of John Taylor Coleridge, the nephew of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and the first of those three generations, that made the greatest impact on me. Fortunately, I can share with Felix memories of Judge Coleridge in the 1830s, traveling from court to court on the Western Circuit, hearing cases that lasted until 2:30 in the morning, 6 persons on one day to try for murder, writing of his distress at the thought of passing the death sentence, and recording the nightmares and indigestive dreams of his old age. And where did he fit into my archival jigsaw puzzle? Well, we return one last time to Albemarle Street. In late 1824, John Taylor Coleridge was appointed editor of the Quarterly Review, succeeding the founding editor, William Gifford. Coleridge edited just 4 issues before he fell out of favor with John Murray, but he is part of the history of the firm. The year I spent valuing the John Murray archive remains the highlight of all I have done. In documenting the history of the Murrays, the archive documents the nation's cultural and intellectual life from 1768 through the 19th and into the early 20th century. It was a period of romanticism and reform, of unprecedented invention, discovery, expansion, social and political change. Many of the most notable and enduring achievements of the period were first recorded and announced in volumes published by John Murray. Yes, the inescapable Byron and Darwin, but also Jane Austen, the intrepid traveler Isabella Bird, David Livingstone, Charles Lyell, Malthus, Mill, Ricardo, Washington Irving, and Herman Melville. The list goes on and on and on. As generations of Murrays became close friends with many of their authors, the tens of thousands of letters were never merely about press corrections, new editions, or sales figures, but filled with news about their lives, travels, families, often sending news of mutual friends. And there I was, fortunate me, working in the drawing room, which had been the center of literary and political conversation in London, where poets and novelists, politicians, diplomats, economists, travelers, scientists, and artists had gathered in the afternoon to exchange news and gossip and ideas. Halfway through my work, I began to worry how best to summarize and present the Murray Archive to the trustees of the National Library of Scotland, for whom I was preparing the valuation, and to their potential funders. At tea time most days, the present John Murray, the 7th, would stop by for a chat and then firmly tell me it was time I got back to work. I tried with varying degrees of success to find something each day to put aside which might either interest or amuse him. The day came when I was reading a letter from Sir Walter Scott. 6 months earlier, Scott and Byron had been introduced in the drawing room. They took an immediate liking to one another and continued to meet nearly every day. Now, back in Edinburgh, Scott writes to Murray, ending his letter with a request to be remembered kindly to Lord Byron and to all the 4 o'clock friends. And that was it, the 4 o'clock friends. It was the perfect summary of the John Murray Archive, and for me, the recognition of how fortunate I have been to spend the last half-century in the company of my own 4 o'clock friends. Thank you.